Today, we tore down and rebuilt the Civivi Conspirator. There were some things that went really smooth, and then there were others that were super frustrating. What's really nice about modern Civivis is that they're all T8 Torx heads all around except for the pocket clip. Those are going to be T6. So we started the teardown by taking out the body screws, and there weren't much issue there, but I could tell you there was quite a bit of blue Loctite on those. Not freezing them in place, but they didn't want to quite fall out once they were done with the threads. It's this next part that really gets frustrating about the teardown of this knife. So we started taking out the pivot screw. As you can see, it's not backing out properly. What that tells me is the show side screw on that pivot barrel is actually backing out, and that sucks to have to deal with. Which we will a little bit later. If I was smart while tearing this down, I would have just let that show side screw fall off and let the pivot come out the other side. Instead, I fought with the screw a little bit, putting a little bit of back and forth torque on it to get it to come out. And then as you see right here, the screw falls out the other side. So now very gently, you see me applying a little bit of pressure with my Torx head right there. And I'm wiggling the blade, trying to get the pivot out, and I just said, screw it. The scales are popping off. It's fine. I can just take it out that way. Now, be careful. When you're taking this thing apart, make sure that spring doesn't go anywhere. It's not a large enough spring that it's really going to shoot out there, but springs do have a tendency to be a pain in the ass when you're tearing these things down. So right here, we're demonstrating how this lock actually works. You can see that little barrel that's actually meeting up with the tang is preventing it from going forward. But when I press it, it relieves the pressure and it allows it to flow through the cutout of that button itself. Now it's time to deal with that show side pivot screw. Now in this particular instance, I don't have red Loctite to use. All we have is blue Loctite on hand, so that's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna put a lot of Loctite on that screw, and then I'm gonna try to mate those two together, the pivot barrel itself and that show side screw. This really turns out to be a pain in the butt because you can't do anything other than take a pair of channel locks with a cloth around that pivot barrel and try to tighten it up as best you can and to get that screw head face to mate with that barrel itself. Now normally I would recommend putting blue Loctite on your other pivot screw, but in this case we want that Loctite to actually set. So if I have to take it apart, I don't want to break the Loctite on the show side. And we're ready to rebuild this guy, so I'm putting a little bit of KPL on the blade to lube up those bearings. All right, so what you're gonna see me do here is try to put the pivot in to hold in the button lock with the spring. Now I'm gonna change my mind on that here in a second and apply the pivot from the back side, which I'm gonna have to take out later, but it's gonna help that blade stay in place until I get the other side of the scales on. So we got the pivot in place. Now I have to deal with this button. So what I do is I'm gonna set the button in place, but then you have to lift the blade so the back side of the button that you don't see falls underneath the tang of the blade itself. All right, and here we're gonna be applying a little bit more KPL to lube up the other side of those bearings. We drop the bearings in place. Now we're ready to put on the other side of the scales. This is a good practice to get into anytime you tear down a knife. Make sure that before you put any screws in, the scales are sitting flush. What can happen if you really try to crank down those screws before the frame is sitting flush, you can actually cause damage to the frame itself, causing your blade not to sit center, causing the action to be a little wonky, a bunch of problems that you just don't need. Now, I don't normally put Loctite on my body screws, and if I do, it's just a dab. But if you do have problem screws that back out on you, yeah, for sure, take them out, Loctite them. But I just don't normally do that. On the pivot screws, on the other hand, definitely want to Loctite those, because I don't care what knife you have. That screw's gonna back out after fidgeting with it for a while. But a word of warning, guys. Do not put too much Loctite on that pivot screw, because it will seep around and get into the pivot itself, causing some gummy action. So what you see me doing here is actually trying to free up the pivot barrel itself. There's certain places that when you're building a knife or rebuilding a knife, that the pivot kind of gets wedged between the scales and the blade. So you have to wiggle that blade around, sometimes closed, sometimes open, and it'll just freely come out. Never force something. There's always a smarter way. Now what you kind of see me struggling with here is getting that Civivi logo to fall into the perfect position so that it sinks all the way into the scale. And when your pivot isn't necessarily free spinning in there, it's really hard to kind of get it with your hands and turn it. Plus, I didn't want to put too much torque on that screw itself because I didn't want that show side screw to back out on me. I forgot to do this part anyway, so it just worked out. I applied some KPL Heavy, that stuff's like gel, to the outside of the pivot barrel. This actually helps your action out immensely because that's where a lot of friction is between that pivot barrel and the hole in your blade. That's metal on metal riding there. It will need a little bit of lubrication, and you guys will thank me once you try it. So what you see me doing here is I'm taking my time and I'm doing slow cranks on that screw, because what I don't want to do is drag that pivot barrel through if that Civivi logo on the other side isn't falling into the slotted position. Here I decide to cut my losses, take the screw out, and back that pivot out just a little bit so that I can realign it to make sure we're doing this all correctly. All right, so we got it all lined up, we think, and I'm pushing it down to see if it seats flush with the scales itself. Right here you can see that it's sitting flush. You can't see it from the side. So now we're ready to actually put that other screw back in that's on the pocket clip side. Now every time that I put a pivot screw back in, I usually will crank it all the way and then start to back it out slightly. You could either do that or just slowly go in, but what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're lining the center of that blade between the scales as you do this. But do not over crank that pivot screw. If you do that, especially with knives on bearings, you can add little dimples or imprints to the steel, because those bearing balls are really hard. They're actually going to be harder than that soft frame steel that's coming on most of these knives. So you're going to get these little dimples, kind of like a golf ball, and what'll happen is it'll make your action just miserable, and it's something that you really can never fix, at least from a layman perspective. If you're a machinist, you might be able to get away with it, but it's jacking up your tolerances. Once I get the action to where I want, I always open the knife up and I check for back and forth, I check for up and down, and make sure that everything we did is correct. This is all a balancing act, because now you have to check the centering, so your action might be good, you might not have any back and forth, you might not have any up and down, but if your blade's off center, it's really going to frustrate you. Just be patient when you're putting these things back together, because if you don't, you're going to regret it later, and then you're going to blame the knife like it's not your fault you messed it up, right? I'm sure it came like that from the factory, huh? The action on this got so much better, and honestly, it's really just from me going in there, cleaning it up, and adding a little bit of lube back to it. It had nothing to do with any gunk or anything. Civivi does a really good job of keeping their knives clean and just having impeccable action. Their tolerances have come a long way.